Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to capture the remaining parts of Sverdlikovo, several advances east and west of Pokrovsk, in the northern and western flank of Kursk and northwest of Velika Novosilka. These advances span over 20 square kilometers, which consists of the largest gains the Russians have made so far this month. As we see here in the Kursk region, the Russians managed to capture the remaining parts of Sverdlikovo all the way to the border area, and the remaining parts in between Sverdlikovo and Nikolaevo Dareno are now under attack by the Russian forces, as the Russians are attempting to align the front line with the Russo-Ukrainian border area. And with this, the Russians have also crossed over the Ulakly river line in relation to further offensive operations across, both to capture Lebedivka and Luknia in the northern direction, but also to launch offensive operations towards the fortified positions in between Sverdlikovo and Sucha, and potentially reach into the Ukrainian side of the border area, where the objective would be to advance all the way down south towards cutting off the main highway and isolating Sucha itself from its supplies from the Ukrainian side of the border. Because if we take a look, this is the only main road. There are some other roads, some paved roads and some dirt roads in other areas, but this is the main highway. This would be the main supply line for the Ukrainian forces. And if the Russians continue across the Sel river here in the southern flank of Sucha, as well as a push through the Luknia river line here in the western part near Ukrainian border and on the Ukrainian side of the border, we will see that the Russians can cut off all of the supply lines, both through guerrilla tactics, but also through direct confrontation and fire control. Moving on to the eastern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to advance east of Pokrovsk, getting control over Berezivka as they continue offensive operations following the capture of Vodiane. Russians also managed to advance further north of Baranivka towards Tarasivka and alongside the southern flank of Sverdlikovo, alongside the main road as well as the forest lines in the area. The Russians are here expanding in three separate directions. The northern direction alongside the main highway, as Russian forces continue to flank the fortified positions alongside the river line and the highway and gain further control over the highway itself for further offensive operations in the northwestern direction as well as the northeastern directions. At the same time, we're also seeing the Russian flanking maneuver of Yelisavetivka alongside the highway in the western direction. Therefore, we see that the Russians are attempting to expand towards every single direction from the intersection area, and this makes sense due to the topography of the area. If we take a look at the intersection itself, it is at an elevation of over 200 meters. In the northern direction, it continues alongside this high ground before, if you go further away from the highway, you see that the elevation goes further down, especially along the river line. And if we take a look at the western direction, it is a similar case, but even alongside the highway itself, the elevation falls, where the peak of the elevation in the area is the intersection itself, and the Russians now control the high ground alongside the entire intersection area. This means that further offensive operations in the northern and eastern directions would be led to a even height battle, while a western push would be a downhill battle, which gives the Russians the advantage with the high ground, and towards the river line will again give the Russians the advantage from the high ground. Therefore, the Russians are looking to expand in every direction from the highest point, which is the intersection area, and naturally an intersection itself in terms of roads is where you go in every single direction. In the northern direction, it is simply a push towards Tarasivka, directly from Baranivka alongside the river line, to bypass the fortified positions and move directly into the town itself. With the Russian push near Berezivka, the Russians can flank the fortified positions from the rear, and with the push from the southern direction, they'll be able to flank it from the side, where a direct push would be from the eastern direction. So with this in mind, the Russians are attacking Tarasivka from its weakest points and taking advantage of the gains in the southern and western direction. From Sverdlikovo in the eastern direction, it is to further push the Ukrainian forces into this pocket as they continue their offensive operations to encircle the Ukrainian forces within it. They want to keep them there for as long as possible and to keep as many of them there as possible as they continue their offensive operations to encircle their forces in the area. The Russians also managed to advance west of Pokrovsk, regaining full control over Pishane and pushing further in the Udashne direction, regaining the initiative in both of these directions, where the goal is now to regain the lost territory and then push further beyond. The situation is still not under Russian control in the Kotlina direction, as the Ukrainians continue their offensive operations to regain control over the town and push the Russians out of both Kotlina and Udashne and out of the main highway to reopen the direct connection between the city of Pokrovsk here in the western parts of the Donetsk region and the city of Zaporizhzhia itself. South of this area, the Russians have also managed to advance in the direction of Zaporizhzhia, where they've managed to gain control over the central parts of the town and push the Ukrainians out to the outskirts of it, disconnecting it from Preobrazhenka, with offensive operations by the Russians both from the eastern direction alongside the forest lines and from the northern flank, both at the rear of Preobrazhenka. As the fighting over Zaporizhzhia draws near the end, the Russians moving on to Preobrazhenka, are following control of which the Russians will be moving on to the final three towns here in the western direction and the fourth town in the northwest. To gain control over these four settlements will allow the Russians to control all of the towns near the border area and reach the Dnipropetrovsk region in one section of the front line, and they can set their forces to operate drones from this area, and this will give them a significant advantage in this entire area towards Novopavlivka for offensive operations in that direction, and the Russians can enter the Dnipropetrovsk region itself. Also allow the Russians to flank the fortified positions from the northern and southern direction, and therefore control over this area, which is hardly defended by Ukrainian forces in terms of fortification, would be left exposed, and the Russians would look to gain control over the border area in this area right here, as Russians are reaching the border area itself with their recent offensive operations, and the Ukrainians are unable to stop the Russian momentum in this direction. The Russians also managed to gain control over the remaining parts of the Andreevka forest lines to near the north of the town and start entering the final fortified positions connected to Andreevka itself, and the fighting will soon be reaching Ulakly. At the same time, offensive operations are reaching Kostyantynopil from northern and southern directions, and the Russians stormed Kostyantynopil itself with armored vehicles through the forest lines and forest patches and into the town itself, where they managed to drop off some infantry. But according to Deep State Map, the Russian forces were unable to attain a foothold, and they were defeated on the way due to Ukrainian FPV drones activity. However, in the Ulakly direction, the Russians also launched an offensive operation with an armored assault, but it managed to gain a foothold in the eastern parts of Ulakly, cutting off the Ukrainian forces to the east near Dashne and the fortified positions, encircling them completely and gaining control over the eastern parts of Ulakly. With this, it's only a matter of days before the Russians gain control over the remaining parts between the Vovcha and Sukhyali river lines, the fortified positions, and Ulakly, and move on to Kostyantynopil, where fighting has already started from the northern and southern directions. It's also reported that the Russians started offensive operations both in the direction of Ruslev as well as Bahadir, where they are attempting to gain a foothold in both of these directions. The Russians were stopped in both of these directions as they were moving towards them, as the main push had some sort of success with Ulakly, and the next most successful one was Kostyantynopil, as the Russians had already cleared the ways all the way up to the towns. Ruslev is a similar case, but it seems that the main effort was directed towards Kostyantynopil itself and Ulakly in the eastern direction to close the pocket and then align the front line from Kurahoven all the way to Bahadir, as currently the Russian forces are advancing from the southern direction, not from the eastern direction, due to the Ukrainian positions in the fortified area and Ulakly. With control over both of these areas, the Russians would have an open road all the way to Kostyantynopil, and offensive operations will take place from the eastern direction as well, and this will significantly improve the Russian offensive operation capabilities in this section of the front line, and the fighting will continue northwest of Velika Novosilka, where the Russians started attacking the first fortified positions along the defensive lines of the Ukrainians northwest of the town, and they also managed to gain a foothold within Novocheretsovate. With this, the Russians have crossed over the river line in two areas near Novy Komor to start the fighting over the fortified positions from the eastern direction, to enter Novocheretsovate from the eastern direction, and continue offensive operations along the Mukryeli river line. And with this, we see that the Russians have significantly stepped up the offensive operations west of Kurhove and northwest of Velika Novosilka, and their objective is likely to gain full control over the Dnipropetrovsk border area within the next month and a half before the start of April. At the same time, we see that the Russian efforts are focused around the southern section of the front line near the Donetsk region, from the east of Pokrovsk and all the way down south to the border area, while areas such as Teretsk, we have seen a stop or almost complete stop of offensive operations following the capture of the city, and in the Jazov Yar direction there's practically been a stalemate as the Russians continue the siege of the apartment complex area. And we can discern from that, based on the fact that the Russians had a break in the southern parts of the Donetsk region, which allowed the Ukrainians to do some counterattacks, we may be seeing a similar situation in the Teretsk direction and in the Jazov Yar direction, where the Russians are rotating their forces and preparing for further offensive operations in the Donetsk region, and this can lead to faster Russian advances. Something I noticed is, at the end of last year, I talked about how Russian Minister of Defense, Belousov, claimed that the Russians would achieve all their goals of their special military operation, the Russo-Ukrainian War, within 2025. And that would mean that the Russians, based on territory alone, would have to capture approximately 60 square kilometers a day on average. And this has been far from the results we've seen in the months of January and so far in February, which means that the Russians are lagging far behind such a goal. But if we looked at the end of 2024, the Russians were advancing at over 30 square kilometers a day, and this would mean that they just had to double it, but they've become slower since. The question raised here is whether it is because of the weather conditions or because of the rotations, or if the Ukrainian resistance strengthened during this period, especially with the recent account of how Ukrainian FPV drones are heavily impacting the Russian offensive operations. Let's take a look at the recent offensive operation towards Kostyantynopil and Ulakly. According to Deep State Map, which is a pro-Ukrainian source, the Russians spent about 20 to 47 armored vehicles to storm both Kostyantynopil and Ulakly. It is according to Ukrainian sources that they actually launched between 20 and 37 towards Kostyantynopil itself, and about 10 towards Ulakly. So the estimate would be 30 to 47. But based on this, we would see that even at the low estimate of 30 armored vehicles, the fact that both of these towns weren't taken over completely just shows exactly the strength of these FPV drones. The Ukrainians don't even have to directly confront the Russian forces, and the defenders of these towns are not alone, as the FPV drone operators in Bahatir, Selenikut, Oleksivka can all support the defense of Kostyantynopil and Ulakly with the drones from these rear towns. And this is exactly what allows the Ukrainian forces to have such a strong position. If the Russians wanted to securely gain control over Kostyantynopil, they would have to simultaneously launch heavy bombardments with artillery, FAB bombs, and their own drones towards Roslev, Kostyantynopil, Ulakly, Bahatir, Oleksivka, Selenikut, Novokrainka, and Odratne, and at that point, with combined strikes on all of these areas at the same time, to a point where the Ukrainian FPV drone operators, artillery operators, and so on cannot respond, at that point the Russians would be able to successfully and with low cost take control over these frontline towns, but in the long run, this would require a lot more than they are currently expending of ammunition, and it would require better air control over the area, all of which the Russians currently lack, but in the long term would be able to gain the upper hand enough to achieve if the situation continues as is. The question is whether Ukraine will be able to continue producing drones at the current rate, or even increase the rate of production of these drones, and if they can find enough drone operators to continue operating all of these drones to successfully hold back the Russian forces. If they are able to continuously improve the drone situation and improve better air support and air defense, then the Ukrainians would be able to significantly slow down, if not completely stop, Russian advances. The Ukrainians regaining control is a completely different question, because they would need a conventional army to do so, which they are lacking more and more as they take more casualties, especially in the Kursk direction. But the defense, the Ukrainian forces are extremely capable, especially with their drone operators, which has left the Russians in a very difficult position in terms of capturing territory, and this is what has led to the very slow advances by the Russians, despite them having significant firepower advantage. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.